Okay, so think about this for a second. You know those notebooks we grab for everything? From jotting down a quick reminder to working through a complex problem.
Yeah.
They're kind of like our constant companions, right? These trusty notebooks.
Definitely. I think for a lot of us, they're almost an extension of our thought process.
Totally. And have you ever noticed when you pick up a notebook how some paper just feels so smooth, it's almost like silk,
Hmm.
and then others have that kind of rough, almost toothy texture.
Yeah. Yeah, I know exactly what you mean. It's a really noticeable difference sometimes.
Right. And that difference in feel that we're talking about often comes down to something that a lot of people don't think about too much: paperweight.
Yeah. And that's what we're diving into today.
Exactly. We're going deep on notebook paperweight.
We are.
We've got a really cool guide that we're going to be using for this deep dive, and we're going to break it all down for you.
Yeah.
So we're not just talking about how heavy the whole notebook is, in your bag.
Right.
We're talking about the actual weight of the individual sheets of paper.
Like the density of the paper itself.
Exactly. And understanding this paperweight thing, it's key to really understanding, how a notebook feels, how durable it is,
Mm-hmm.
and ultimately how well it's going to work for you, whether you're a hardcore journaler or just someone who likes to jot down notes.
And I think it's especially important if you're thinking about designing your own notebook.
Yeah.
If you want to create something
Yeah.
custom, understanding paperweight is going to make a huge difference.
Absolutely. And let's be honest, when you start looking at all those notebook specs online or in stores, it's like you get hit with this wall of acronyms.
Oh, yeah. GSM, pound PT. What does it all mean?
It's like a secret code, right?
Yeah, it can be really confusing.
So our mission today is to crack that code.
Right.
To figure out what these different paperweight measurements actually mean and what that means for the paper that we use every day.
That's right.
So you've probably seen these numbers, GSM, pounds, points. They're kind of floating around on notebook descriptions.
Mhm.
Like I said, it's a secret code. So let's start by cracking that code by tackling GSM, grams per square meter. What is that telling us about a sheet of paper?
So GSM is really straightforward. It's the weight in grams of 1 square meter of paper.
Okay.
So basically, the higher the GSM number, the heavier and thicker the paper is going to be.
Okay, so higher GSM, heavier, thicker, got it.
Yeah. So, for example, like an 80 GSM paper is going to feel pretty light and flexible,
Okay.
whereas something like a 300 GSM is going to be much more substantial. It's going to feel almost rigid.
Wow. Okay, yeah, that's a big difference.
Yeah, it is. And GSM is a really useful way to compare the weight of different papers. Like if you're looking at 2 different notebooks.
Right. Just compare the GSMs and you get a good sense of which one's going to be thicker.
Exactly.
Awesome. Okay, so GSM, we got that one down. What about pounds?
Ah, pounds.
That's the one that I always trip over. I don't know why it just doesn't click for me.
Yeah, I think a lot of people feel that way about pounds.
Okay, good. I'm not alone.
No. So the pound system, it's mostly used in the U.S.,
Okay.
and it's a little less direct than GSM.
Okay. How so?
So it tells you the weight of what's called a ream of paper.
A ream.
Yeah, that's 500 sheets.
500 sheets. Okay.
But here's the thing. It's 500 sheets of a specific size, a standard size sheet of paper, and that size is 17 inches by 22 inches.
Okay, so it's not just any 500 sheets. It's 500 sheets of that big size.
Exactly. That's the key. And the weight of that ream, that 500 sheets of that big size, is what gives you the basis weight in pounds.
Oh, okay. So if I see a notebook that says 20-pound paper,
Mm-hmm.
that means 500 sheets of that big 17 by 22 inch paper weighed 20 pounds.
Exactly. Before it gets cut down to notebook size, obviously.
Right. Of course. Of
Yeah.
course. So it's like the weight of the paper before it becomes a notebook.
Yeah, you got it. And just like with GSM, a higher pound number means a heavier paper.
Okay. That part's straightforward.
It is, but the tricky part is that it's based on the weight of that specific large sheet size.
Right. That 17 by 22.
Yeah, and that's why comparing pounds to GSM can be a little confusing.
Yeah, like comparing apples and oranges.
Exactly, because GSM gives you the weight per area regardless of the sheet size.
Okay. So GSM, consistent weight per area, pounds weight of a specific bulk size.
You got it.
That makes it way clearer, actually. Thank you.
No problem.
Okay, so we've got GSM, we've got pounds. Now, what about points? I've seen that on like thicker cards and stuff.
Yeah, points usually abbreviated as DEPT is all about the thickness of the paper.
Okay.
So 1 point is equal to 1/1000th of an inch.
Okay.
So you'll see this measurement used for things like cardstock,
Yeah.
thick notebook covers heavier papers.
Okay.
So a 14-point notebook cover would be 0.014 inches thick.
So it's a direct measure of thickness.
Exactly. It tells you exactly how thick that material is.
Okay, that's pretty straightforward.
It is.
So points thickness GSM and pounds weight. And weight usually means thicker, but not always.
That's a really important point. And actually, our guy highlights this specifically.
It does, yeah. It
Yeah.
says GSM and thickness aren't always a perfect match.
Yeah, they're not always directly correlated.
Why is that?
Well, it's because the way the paper is made, its composition, how tightly those fibers are packed together,
Yeah.
it all affects the perceived thickness.
Oh, okay. So it's not just about how much the paper weighs. It's about how that weight is distributed.
Exactly.
So could you have like two papers that have the exact same GSM, same weight,
Yeah,
but one feels thicker?
absolutely. You could definitely have that.
How does that work?
So imagine you have one paper where the fibers are all kind of loosely packed, and then you have another paper with the same weight, but the fibers are really compressed.
Okay.
The one with the loosely packed fibers is going to feel thicker, even though it weighs the same as the more compressed paper.
Oh, that's interesting. So it's like the air in between the fibers makes a difference.
Yeah, it really does. And it also affects the feel. The paper with the loosely packed fibers might feel softer and more flexible.
Hmm. Okay, so if I'm like really looking for a notebook that feels substantial,
hmm
I shouldn't just look at the GSM. I should look for other clues too.
Yeah, exactly. GSM is a great starting point, but it's not the whole story.
Okay.
So look at the paper's description. Sometimes they'll say things like laid finish or smooth finish, and that can give you an idea of how it might feel.
Right. Right. Okay, cool. So we've got the measurements figured out. We kind of know the difference between weight and thickness.
Mm-hmm.
Now our guide, it's got this really handy table. It's got like common uncoated paper weights and their approximate thicknesses in millimeters.
Yeah.
So I thought it'd be fun to run through a few of these just to kind of give our listeners a better sense of, what these numbers actually feel like in real life.
I think that's a great idea.
Cool. So let's start with like a really light paper, a 60 GSM paper.
Okay, so 60 GSM, that's going to be really thin.
How thin are we talking?
We're talking about 0.075 millimeters.
0.075 millimeters. Wow, that's thin.
Yeah, it's like the paper you might find in a really cheap notebook.
Or like a notepad.
Exactly. It's going to feel pretty flimsy, almost delicate.
Okay, what about 80 GSM? That's kind of like the standard notebook paperweight, right?
Yeah, 80 GSM is pretty common, and that comes in at about 0.1 millimeters.
0.10 millimeters, so a little bit thicker.
Yeah, you can definitely feel a difference between 60 and 80.
Okay, cool. And what about if we bump it up to 100 GSM?
So 100 GSM is going to be about 0.12 millimeters.
Okay, so we're gradually getting thicker here.
Yeah, and at 100 GSM, you're starting to get into a paper that feels a bit more premium.
Right. It's not quite so flimsy.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's jump up to 150 GSM. What's that like?
150 GSM is about 0.15 millimeters thick, and this is where you start to see a big improvement in terms of opacity.
Opacity, what does that mean?
It means you're less likely to see the ink from the other side of the page.
Oh, okay, so less ghosting.
Exactly. Less ghosting, less bleed through.
That's good for people who like to use both sides of the paper.
Definitely 150 GSM is a good choice for that.
Okay, cool. All right, what about 200 GSM?
200 GSM, we're at about 0.18 millimeters now.
Okay.
This paper feels really sturdy. You can definitely tell the difference.
It's getting serious now.
Yeah, it is. It's almost like cardstock, but still flexible enough to use for notebook pages.
Right. Okay, and then finally the big one, 300 GSM.
300 GSM. This is a thick paper. It's about 0.35 millimeters.
0.35, that's thick.
Yeah, it's thick. And you'll see this used for things like postcards, or really sturdy notebook covers.
Right, it's like you could almost like carve into that paper.
Yeah, it's got that kind of feel to it. It makes a real statement, when you hold something printed on 300 GSM paper.
Totally. Okay, so seeing those millimeter measurements next to the GSM, I don't know why, but that really helps me visualize it.
Yeah, I think it gives you a much more concrete sense of what we're talking about.
It does, for sure. Okay, so now let's shift gears a little bit and talk about how these different paper weights actually show up in the notebooks that we use.
Okay.
Our guide breaks it down into a few categories, starting with lightweight paper.
Right.
That's 60 to 80 GSM range.
Yeah.
So what kind of notebooks typically use that kind of paper?
So lightweight paper, it's all about keeping the notebook slim and light.
Okay.
So you'll find it in things like multi-page journals, those really thick journals,
Okay.
planners, where you need a page for every day of the year,
Right.
and those classic softcover diary notebooks.
Okay, so lots of pages without a lot of bulk.
Exactly. That's the main advantage of lightweight paper.
Yeah.
It's also usually more affordable.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
And it's easy to write on. with most pens and pencils.
Cool. But what are the downsides?
Well, the trade-off is that it can be a little fragile.
Mm-hmm.
It tears more easily,
Right.
and it's also not as opaque.
Like we were talking about before, the ghosting.
Exactly. You might get some ghosting where you can see the writing from the other side of the page.
Right.
And sometimes even bleed through, especially if you're using a pen with really wet ink.
Okay, so it's a trade-off portability and affordability for a little less durability and potential ink issues.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Okay, cool. So let's move up to the next category, medium weight paper.
Okay.
That 80 to 120 GSM range. What kind of notebooks are we talking about here?
So this is a really popular range. It's kind of like the sweet spot for a lot of notebooks.
Okay.
You get a good balance between durability and weight.
Okay.
So you'll see this in things like spiral-bound notebooks,
Okay.
which need to be able to withstand a little bit more handling.
All right, right. Makes sense.
And also in like nicer soft-covered journals
Okay.
that have a little bit more substance to them.
So what are the benefits of this middle-of-the-road paperweight?
So the opacity is much better.
Okay, so less ghosting.
Yeah, much less ghost, less bleed through, so you could use a wider range of pens,
Right.
and it just feels more durable overall.
Okay. Are there any downsides to consider?
Well, it might not have that super luxurious thick feel
Okay.
that you get with some of the heavier papers.
Right.
And if you're doing something really demanding, like artwork with wet media,
Mm-hmm.
it might not be quite sturdy enough.
Right. But for everyday writing, it's probably a good option.
Yeah, for everyday writing, it's a great choice.
Okay, cool. So let's move up to the heavy hitters heavyweight paper, 120 to 160 GSM.
Now we're talking.
This is where you get into like the fancy notebooks, right?
Yeah, this is where you start to see those premium notebooks.
Okay, so what kind of notebooks use heavyweight paper?
So things like hardcover journals that are designed to last a long time,
Okay.
specialized planners,
Mm-hmm.
the ones that have all the bells and whistles,
Right.
and just notebooks that are meant to feel really substantial and high quality.
So it's all about that premium feel.
Yeah, exactly.
So what are the big advantages of going with heavyweight paper?
Durability is a big one.
Okay.
These papers can really stand up to wear and tear.
They can take a beating.
They can. And they're also great for color printing because the ink doesn't bleed through as much.
Oh, that's good to know.
Yeah, so if you're using a notebook that has like color pages, or if you're doing a lot of printing in your notebook, heavyweight paper is a good choice.
Okay, cool. Are there any reasons why someone might not want to go with a heavyweight paper?
Well, cost is the main one.
Okay. Yeah, I imagine it's more expensive.
It is, heavier papers are more expensive to produce, so the notebooks are going to cost more.
Makes sense.
And also, some people just prefer a slimmer, lighter notebook.
Right, right. If you're carrying it around all day.
Yeah, and for them, heavyweight paper might just be a little too bulky.
Too much.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. And then finally we have the ultra heavyweights, the extra heavyweight paper.
They're big guys.
200 to 300 GSM. Now, our guide mentions that this is often used for covers. Why is that?
Yeah, so at this weight, you're getting into paper that's incredibly sturdy.
Okay.
It's almost like cardboard.
Wow.
And it's great for protecting the inner pages of a notebook.
Right, so it's like a shield.
Exactly. It's a shield, and it also just gives the notebook this really high-quality feel.
Like you're holding something special.
Yeah, exactly. So it's often used for hardcover notebook covers,
Okay.
specialty sketchbooks where artists might be using heavier media,
Right.
and things like presentation booklets, where you want to make a good impression.
Right, so it's all about durability and making a statement.
Yeah. Yes, in a nutshell.
What are the drawbacks, though?
Well, cost again?
Right. This has got to be the most expensive.
It is. It's the priciest category of paper.
Okay.
And it's also way too thick to use for the pages inside a notebook.
Right, you'd have like a 5-page notebook that weighs 10 pounds.
Yeah, exactly. It would be ridiculous.
So it's really best suited for those specific applications where you need that super high durability.
Yeah, and that premium feel.
Awesome. Okay, so this has been really helpful. I feel like I've got a much better understanding of how paperweight affects the feel and the function of a notebook.
Yeah.
But now let's talk to our listener for a minute. The person who's out there trying to choose a notebook.
Mm-hmm.
What are the key things that they should keep in mind when they're trying to figure out what paperweight is right for them?
So the most important thing is to think about how you're going to use the notebook.
Right.
Is this for quick notes, just jotting things down?
Yeah.
Or are you planning to use it for, like, long-term journaling?
Mm-hmm.
If it's for everyday tasks, lightweight or medium weight paper is usually fine.
Yeah, and it's going to be easier on the wallet.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But if you're going to be using it a lot, for important writing projects or artwork,
Yeah.
then bumping up to a heavier weight is probably a good idea.
Okay, cool. And what about the tools that people are using to write, pens,
Yeah.
pencils, markers, that kind of thing?
Yeah, that's really important too.
Okay.
So if you love fountain pens or markers,
Mm-hmm.
you're going to want to go with a heavier paper that has good opacity.
To prevent the bleed through.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you're going to have ink all over the place.
Right. And if you're mainly using like a ballpoint pen or a pencil.
Then you have a bit more flexibility. You can probably get away with a lighter weight paper.
Okay, cool. And then, of course, there's the budget to consider.
Right. Always the budget.
Heavier papers are more expensive, so that's something to keep in mind.
Yeah, it is.
So the takeaway here is that there's no one best paperweight. It really depends on what you're going to use the notebook for and what you prefer.
Exactly. It's all about finding the right match.
And those lighter, more affordable notebooks, they're great for everyday use.
Yeah, they serve a purpose.
But stepping up in weight, it gives you that extra durability and that premium feel. So it's really up to you.
It is.
Awesome. So here's something for you to think about now that you're a paperweight expert.
Uh-huh.
Will it change the way you choose your next notebook?
That's a good question.
Will you start looking at the GSM or the pounds or the points?
I think it's something to be aware of, for sure.
Yeah, I think so too. And, this whole paperweight thing is just one piece of the puzzle when it comes to notebooks.
Right. There's a lot more to it than that.
There's the paper, finish, the binding, all these other factors.
Exactly.
But understanding paperweight, it's a great starting point.
It is.
It's like the foundation for finding that perfect notebook.
Couldn't agree more.
Awesome. Thanks for diving into this with me.
No problem. It was fun.
Cool.
Yeah.
All right, that's it for our deep dive into notebook paperweight.
See ya.
We'll see you next time.
Bye.